Abigail Whittaker stood at the top of the ballroom staircase and did not tremble. 8 years of silence. 8 years of being told she was too plain, too tired, too much. Behind her stood a county solicitor, 2 bankers, and the woman who had raised the man now frozen at the center of that gilded room. Abigail did not raise her voice. She raised a sealed packet of documents and looked her husband dead in the eye. If you are watching from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if no one has told you yet, subscribe because this one does not end the way he planned. Nathaniel Harrow had planned every detail of that evening. He had selected Selina Vale's gown himself, ivory silk cut low at the collar, expensive enough to signal wealth without announcing desperation. He had arranged their arrival time with the precision of a man who understood that Richmond society ran on appearances the way a mill ran on water. Early enough to be seen, late enough to be noticed. He had rehearsed the introduction twice in the carriage the way a man rehearses a sermon he does not quite believe. Selina had laughed at that. She had a laugh like a crystal bell, bright and hollow in equal measure, and she pressed her gloved hand against his arm and said, "You worry too much, Nathaniel. This is Richmond, not a courtroom." "Richmond is always a courtroom," he said, and he had not been wrong. The governor's summer ball of 1816 was the single most consequential social gathering in Virginia, and every family of standing knew it. Invitations were extended in late May and received like verdicts. To attend was to be counted among the living. To be excluded was a quiet kind of death that no one discussed aloud, but everyone understood. Nathaniel Harrow of Harrowfield Estate had attended every year since his father passed the ledger books to him at 22. He intended to attend every year until he died. He had not invited his wife. Abigail had been told through a note delivered by the household steward, and not by Nathaniel himself, that her presence would be unnecessary at the ball. The note used the word unnecessary, the way a man uses a word when he means something crueler, but lacks the honesty to say it plainly. Abigail had read the note twice, folded it along its original crease, and placed it in the small cedar box on her writing desk, where she kept things she did not wish to forget. She had not cried. She had not confronted him. She had gone back to the ledger books spread across that same desk and returned to the column of numbers she had been studying for the better part of 3 months. That had been 4 weeks ago. Tiag, the Harrowfield house had been quiet all day. The kitchen staff moved carefully, the way servants move in a house where the emotional weather shifts without warning. The younger maids had whispered that the master was taking Miss Vale to the governor's ball, which was not a surprise to anyone who paid attention and a great offense to everyone who loved the mistress. Cook, a large, warm-blooded woman named Dora, who had been with the Harrow family since before Nathaniel was born, had said nothing all morning, but her biscuits came out harder than usual, which was a language all its own. Abigail had dressed that morning in her plain gray work dress, the one with the ink stain near the left cuff that she had never quite managed to remove, and she had sat at her desk while the summer heat pressed against the window glass, and she had worked. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers, even as a girl in her father's house in Fredericksburg, when she would sit beside him on Saturday afternoons while he went through the account books for his trading business, and she would catch his errors before he did. Her father had called it a gift. Nathaniel, in the early years of their marriage, had called it remarkable. Later, when the shine wore off, everything he had called it unfeminine. She had kept working regardless. The documents on her desk that morning were not household accounts. They had not been household accounts for some time. They were copies carefully made, carefully hidden of Harrowfield's estate ledgers for the past 4 years. Cross-referenced against County Land Records Bank correspondence from 2 separate Richmond institutions, and a collection of tenant payment receipts that did not match the figures Silas Pembroke reported to Nathaniel each quarter. Silas Pembroke was Nathaniel's estate manager. He was 42 years old, thick through the chest, with a manner of speaking that made ordinary deception sound like reasonable business practice. He had served Harrowfield for 11 years. He was trusted completely. He was stealing. Abigail had known it for 3 months. She had the proof for 6 weeks. She had been waiting for the right moment, and she had understood, with the cold and patient clarity, that comes from years of being underestimated that the right moment was not a private conversation in a back office. The right moment was a room full of witnesses. At 7:30 that evening, Abigail rose from her desk. She called for her maid, a sharp-eyed young woman named Ruth, who had been with her since before the children were born, and who understood without needing to be told that something of importance was happening. "My blue gown," Abigail said. "The dark one." Ruth did not ask questions. She helped Abigail dress with quiet, efficient hands, and when the last button was fastened and the small pearl earrings were in place, she stepped back and looked at her mistress with an expression that Abigail could not quite read. "You look like yourself, ma'am," Ruth said finally. "The real one." Abigail picked up the sealed packet from her desk, thick with documents tied with a narrow black ribbon, and walked out of the room. The carriage she had arranged did not belong to Harrowfield. She had hired it herself, paid for from her own account, which her father had left her, and which Nathaniel had never managed to touch because it was held in her maiden name under the terms of her father's will. That had been an oversight on Nathaniel's part, or perhaps not an oversight at all, but simply a failure to imagine that it would ever matter. It mattered now. She was not alone in the carriage. Beside her sat Mr. Caleb Trent, County Solicitor, a quiet man with a careful manner who had reviewed her documents 3 weeks prior and had gone pale at what he found. Across from her sat Mr. George Aldridge of the Richmond Merchant Bank and Mr. Thomas Vance of the First Virginia Banking House, both of whom had in private meetings over the preceding month confirmed that the accounts Abigail presented were accurate, that the signatures on certain transfer documents were not Nathaniel's, and that Harrowfield Estate had been systematically drained in a fashion that, had it continued another 18 months, would have resulted in forced sale. And beside Mr. Vance, sitting straight-backed and silent, her hands folded over a cream silk reticule, was Mrs. Beatrice Harrow, Nathaniel's mother. 70 years old, Virginia-bred, and furious in the contained way of a woman who had been gracious her entire life, and had finally decided that grace had its limits. None of them spoke during the ride. There was nothing left to say. Everything had been said in offices and parlors over the preceding weeks. Tonight was not a conversation. Tonight was a reckoning. The governor's ball was at full crest when their carriage arrived. Light poured from every window of the stone house. Carriages lined the circular drive 3 deep. The sound of a string quartet drifted out across the summer air, along with voices and laughter, and the particular hum of a large room full of people who believed themselves at the center of the world. Abigail stepped down from the carriage without assistance. She stood for a moment on the drive, the sealed packet held against her side, and she breathed in the night air, and thought of nothing in particular. Then she walked to the door. The footman at the entrance looked at her with the brief, practiced assessment of a man trained to recognize whether a guest belongs. She held his gaze until he stepped aside. Inside the ballroom opened before her candlelight summer silk, the press and movement of Richmond's finest. She did not search the room frantically. She stood at the top of the stairs and let her eyes settle slowly the way a woman settles into a chair she has earned. She found him in under 10 seconds. Nathaniel stood near the center of the room with Selina Vale at his side. He was laughing at something, that broad, easy laugh he used when he wanted a room to like him, and Selina was turned slightly toward him, with her hand resting on his forearm and her ivory gown catching the candlelight like a performance. They looked. Abigail thought exactly like what they were, 2 people who had convinced themselves that no one was watching them clearly. She descended the stairs. The room did not fall silent all at once. It shifted the way a river shifts when something changes the current gradually, then all at once. Faces turned. Conversations faltered. A woman near the punch bowl touched her companion's arm and tilted her head toward the staircase. A man stopped mid-sentence. The string quartet, bless them, continued playing for another 30 seconds before the first violin noticed the change in the room, and the sound petered out note by note. Nathaniel was not watching the stairs. He was mid-sentence himself, addressing the county commissioner on his left, and his back was angled away from the entrance. Selina saw Abigail first. The color left her face the way color leaves a fire when the air is cut off fast and completely. "Nathaniel," Selina said. He did not hear her. "Nathaniel!" Her hand tightened on his arm. He turned. Abigail watched the exact moment he understood what was happening. It moved across his face in layers: confusion, first, then recognition, then something that was almost panic, dressed quickly in the clothes of dignity. He straightened. His jaw set. He took one step toward the edge of the gathering, as though he might intercept her before she reached the center of the room. He did not take a second step because Beatrice Harrow stepped forward from behind Abigail's shoulder, and the sight of his own mother, white-gloved, straight-spined, and regarding him with the expression of a woman who has not forgotten a single thing, stopped him as effectively as a locked door. "Mother," he said, and his voice came out wrong. Too small, too unsure. "Not yet," Beatrice said quietly, and she did not break his gaze. The room was silent now, truly silent. Even the servants near the walls had gone still. The governor himself stood near the fireplace with his punch glass arrested halfway to his lips, watching with the alert attention of a man who understands that history sometimes announces itself with good manners before it burns everything down. Abigail stopped in the center of the room. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed volume to be heard. She had simply needed people to finally stop talking long enough to listen. "Mr. Harrow?" Her voice was even, clear. The voice of a woman who had spent 8 years learning to feel everything and show nothing, and who had now made a deliberate choice to show exactly as much as was necessary. "I received your note, the one explaining that my presence at this gathering would be unnecessary." A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp. Something between a held breath and a murmur. Nathaniel's face had gone through 3 more changes in the past 30 seconds. He settled now on a kind of controlled, furious composure. "Abigail, this is not the place." "You chose the place," she said. "Not me." Selina took a small step backward. It was involuntary, and everyone in the room noticed it. Abigail turned slightly and extended her hand toward Mr. Trent, who stepped forward and took the sealed packet from her. He held it with both hands the way a man holds something he understands the weight of. "Mr. Caleb Trent, County Solicitor," Abigail said to the room with the measured introduction of a woman who has rehearsed nothing because she has had to rehearse nothing. She knows exactly what she is doing. "Mr. George Aldridge of the Richmond Merchant Bank. Mr. Thomas Vance of the First Virginia Banking House." The 3 men stepped forward in turn, and the room absorbed the sight of them with the collective comprehension of people who understand that bankers and solicitors do not appear at summer balls without reason. "These gentlemen have reviewed the financial records of Harrowfield Estate," Abigail continued. "They have reviewed land transfer documents, tenant accounts, banking correspondence, and a considerable number of invoices submitted by Mr. Silas Pembroke over the past 4 years. At the name Pembroke, something shifted near the far side of the room. A large man in a dark coat standing near the card tables with the easy posture of a man who had not expected to be named tonight went very still. "The records are fraudulent," Abigail said. "The signatures are forged, the accounts do not match, and Harrowfield Estate without intervention would have been insolvent within the year." Nathaniel's voice came out hard and low. "You have no right to—" "She had every right," Mr. Aldridge said, and his voice, rich and measured, carried the length of the room. "Mrs. Harrow brought these documents to our institution 6 weeks ago. She has been entirely correct in her assessment. We have confirmed it independently. Furthermore," Mr. Trent said, drawing a folded document from his coat, "Mrs. Harrow's personal financial intervention conducted from her own inherited accounts has satisfied the outstanding loan obligations on 3 parcels of Harrowfield land that were within 30 days of defaulting to creditors operating under Mr. Pembroke's direction." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This one had weight to it. This one pressed against the walls. Nathaniel stood in the center of it, and for the first time in the 8 years Abigail had been married to him, she watched him run out of things to say. Selina found her voice before he did. "You can't do this," she said. Her voice was bright and shaking like that crystal bell in a wind it was not built for. You can't just walk in here, and this is slander. This is Nathaniel, tell them. Miss Vale. Beatrice Harrow's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. Quiet. Absolute. You are speaking in a room where my daughter-in-law is telling the truth. I would encourage you to consider your next words very carefully. Selina's mouth closed. Her hand dropped from Nathaniel's arm. He did not reach for it. Abigail looked at her husband across the candle-lit room, and she felt not triumph, not grief. Something older and quieter than either the feeling of a woman who has finally said aloud the thing she has been carrying alone in the dark for longer than anyone around her had known to ask about. She reached into the pocket of her dark blue gown and she withdrew her wedding ring. She had removed it that afternoon. She had held it for a long time before she placed it in her pocket, not because she was uncertain, but because she believed that everything deserved to be felt fully before it was finished. She crossed the room. The crowd parted for her without a word. She stopped in front of Nathaniel, and she took his hand, and she placed the ring in his palm, and she closed his fingers over it with both of her hands gently, the way you close a door on something you will not be returning to. She looked up at him. You were never ashamed of my weakness, Nathaniel, she said quietly, so that only he could hear and everyone could see. You were ashamed of my strength. She released his hand. She turned and she walked back through the crowd, and the crowd let her go. And the string quartet, God Bless Them, began to play again softly, as though the world required a moment to gather itself before it continued. Near the far wall, 2 county officers had stationed themselves beside Silas Pembroke, who had not moved and who now had nowhere left to go. Abigail did not look back. The night did not end cleanly. Nothing real ever does. The carriages began pulling away from the governor's drive in 1s and 2s, and the sound of wheels on summer dry gravel was the only noise that felt honest in the aftermath of what had happened inside. Richmond society, which prided itself on knowing everything before it happened and discussing everything after, with the carefully calibrated discretion of people who understood that today's gossip was tomorrow's ammunition, had witnessed something it did not yet have language for. They would find the language. They always did. But in those first minutes after Abigail Whittaker Harrow walked out of that ballroom, even the most practiced talkers in Virginia stood quiet and let the moment settle over them like ash after a fire. Nathaniel Harrow did not leave immediately. That was the first thing people noticed afterward, when they began the long, thorough work of discussing what they had seen. He stayed. He stood in the center of that room for a long time after Abigail walked out. His fist closed around the ring she had placed in his palm, and he did not speak, and he did not move. And the crowd gave him a wide berth, the way crowds give wide berth to a man who has just understood something terrible about himself in public. Selina Vale had retreated to a corner near the second set of windows, with 2 of her acquaintances, women, who had attached themselves to her social rise with the enthusiasm of people who had sensed early that she was going somewhere and wanted to be carried along. They spoke to her in low, urgent voices. She did not appear to hear them. Beatrice Harrow accepted a glass of water from a passing servant, thanked him by name. She had always known the names of servants, which was one of the qualities that made her formidable in a way her son had never quite managed. And then she sat in a chair near the fireplace and waited with the patience of a woman who understood that the evening was not over simply because the most dramatic portion of it had concluded. She was right. It took 11 minutes for Nathaniel to cross the room to her. She watched him come. She did not help him by meeting him halfway or by adjusting her expression to make the approach easier. She had raised him, had loved him with the specific and complicated love of a mother who sees her child's flaws as clearly as his gifts, and she had watched him become over the past several years a man she recognized less and less. Tonight she had made a choice. She had ridden in that carriage beside his wife, and she intended to be clear about what that choice meant. "Mother!" His voice was still wrong. Too careful. The voice of a man assembling himself word by word. "Sit down, Nathaniel," she said. He sat. The chair across from her was too small for the conversation they were about to have, but he sat in it anyway, which she took as a reasonable sign that some part of him still understood the basic architecture of humility, even if he had forgotten how to live in it. "How long have you known?" he asked. "That your wife was saving your estate from ruin?" Beatrice set her water glass on the side table with a precise, quiet click. "Long enough. Abigail came to me 2 weeks ago. She did not ask for my permission. She asked for my presence tonight, and she explained why. I said yes." Something moved through his face. "You might have told me." "I might have," she agreed. "But Abigail asked me not to, and I made her a promise, and I keep my promises, which is more than I can say for the promises you made 8 years ago in that church in Fredericksburg." The words landed the way she intended them to, flat and precise and without cruelty, which somehow made them worse. "She could have come to me," Nathaniel said. "If she found something wrong with the accounts, she could have come to you." Beatrice looked at her son steadily. The man who sent her a note through a servant, telling her she was not fit to appear in public beside him. The man who has praised another woman's appearance in mixed company 3 times this season that I am personally aware of. The man who has not eaten dinner with his own wife in 4 months. She paused. Yes, she ought to have brought her concerns to that man. I can see why that seemed like the obvious choice. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He looked away. Across the room, Selina was being gently but firmly separated from her corner by the 2 county officers who had waited with quiet professionalism for the social formalities of the evening to reach a natural pause before they attended to the professional matter of Silas Pembroke. The process was drawing eyes. "Pembroke," Nathaniel said, and his voice changed. The self-justification drained out of it, and something rawer came through. "How much?" Beatrice reached into her reticule and withdrew a single folded sheet. A summary written in Abigail's precise small hand that she had given to Beatrice the week prior as a courtesy so that the elder woman would not walk into this evening uninformed. She held it out. He took it. He read it. She watched his face. He read it twice. Then he set it on his knee and he pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead, and he sat like that for a long moment, and Beatrice, who had not allowed herself to feel sorry for him, yet, because she believed in the sequence of things, accountability, first compassion, after waited. 4 years, he said finally, very nearly. And she... He stopped, started again. She found it herself. She found it herself, confirmed. It herself secured the documentation. Herself approached 2 banks and a solicitor, independently covered 3 loan defaults from her own inherited accounts, and then waited 4 weeks for the appropriate moment to present the evidence publicly. Beatrice folded her hands in her lap. Because she understood correctly that a private conversation with you would have been managed, minimized, and ultimately dismissed. You have not given her reason to believe otherwise. He said nothing for a long time. Where has she gone? He asked. Home, Beatrice said. And I suggest you do not follow her tonight. Abigail arrived back at Harrowfield at 10:15. Ruth was waiting. She had the particular alert stillness of a woman who had spent all evening listening for wheels on the drive, and when Abigail came through the door, she did not ask how it went, because Abigail's face told her enough, and because Ruth understood that some moments were too large and too private for the word how to do any real work. She helped Abigail out of the dark blue gown. She brought warm water. She brought a cup of chamomile tea without being asked, set it on the nightstand, and then she said, "The children are asleep, ma'am. I checked them myself an hour ago." "Thank you, Ruth." "Both fine." Little James had a spider in his room that required a considerable amount of drama to remove, but he's settled now. Abigail almost laughed. Not quite the evening sat too heavily for that, but the corner of her mouth moved. Of course he did. Ruth paused at the door. "Ma'am, for what it's worth." She stopped, then continued in the careful voice of a woman choosing her words with intention. "I have worked for a great many families in this state. I have seen things managed well and managed badly. What you did tonight, the way you did it there, are people in that room who will not forget it. Not ever." Abigail looked at her. Was that meant to make me feel better or worse? Better, Ruth said. I'm told I'm not very good at it, but the intention was better. She left. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the tea and held it with both hands and let the quiet of the house come around her. The children were asleep. The accounts were filed. The bankers had the copies. Trent had the originals sealed and logged. Everything that needed to be set in motion was in motion. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. It was the tiredness of a woman who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down, and who finds that the absence of the weight is its own kind of strange. She had not cried yet. She thought she probably would eventually. Not tonight. She opened the cedar box on her nightstand. She looked at the folded note inside, unnecessary. And she thought about 8 years, which was not a small number. And she thought about the girl she had been when she came to Harrowfield as a bride 23 years old, with ink-stained fingers, and a genuine belief that love properly tended could survive almost anything. She had been right about love. She had simply been wrong about which love she was tending. She closed the box and drank her tea and did not open it again. 8 years prior, in the June of 1808. Nathaniel Harrow had been a different kind of man, not entirely different. The bones of the man he would become were already there. The pride, the sensitivity to appearance, the awareness of how things looked, but they had not yet hardened into the shape they would eventually take. And in the summer of his courtship, he had worn them lightly, the way a young man wears his father's coat before he fully grows into it. He had met Abigail at her father's house in Fredericksburg. He had gone there on business. Her father, Edmund Whittaker, was a merchant of considerable local standing, with connections to several trading houses in Philadelphia, and a reputation for fair dealing that Nathaniel's estate accounts could have used, and he had expected to spend 2 days going over shipping contracts and return to Richmond without incident. He had spent 4 days. He had returned 3 more times before summer's end. Abigail had not been presented to him as a prospect. She had simply been there at the dinner table on the first evening, quiet and precise in her opinions, with a habit of listening to a conversation fully before she entered it, that made her contributions land with unusual weight. She had disagreed with her father about the terms of a particular contract within the first 10 minutes of Nathaniel's presence at that table, and she had done it without flinching or softening the disagreement for the sake of company. And Edmund Whittaker had listened to her and said, "She may be right." And that had been that. Nathaniel had been fascinated. He was accustomed to women who performed intelligence as a social grace, who asked careful questions and received answers with expressions of delighted surprise. And he had not before encountered a woman who simply was intelligent, the way a river is wet without performance and without apology. He had courted her honestly. That was the truth. Whatever came after the early courtship had been honest. He had not hidden his financial situation, which was complex. His father had died, leaving Harrowfield with debts that were manageable but real. And Nathaniel had said so directly in his second visit, because he was not then the kind of man who concealed difficult truths from people he respected. Abigail had asked him for the specifics. He had provided them. She had asked 3 follow-up questions that demonstrated she had processed the information at a depth that surprised him. "You're not frightened by this," he had said. "I'm practical," she had said. "There's a difference." He had proposed in October of 1808 in her father's garden, and she had accepted with the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who had made a considered decision and was at peace with it. Her father had embraced him and called him son. They had been married in the spring. The first 2 years had been good. That was what made it so hard to trace afterward where exactly the rot had set in. Because there had been real warmth between them in those early years. Nathaniel had come home from Richmond meetings and told Abigail about them in detail because he genuinely valued her read on people and situations. She had sat beside him at the estate desk on winter evenings and caught 3 accounting errors in the first year. Alone errors that would have cost real money, and he had been grateful and proud and entirely sincere about both. He had loved her. Abigail had never doubted that, not really. What she had come to understand over time, and with the particular clarity of a woman who watched more than she spoke, was that Nathaniel's love had always been somewhat conditional in ways he himself had not recognized. He had loved her competence when it supported him. He had loved her intelligence when it was applied to his concerns. He had loved her calm when it made his house peaceful. He had not examined carefully enough what would happen when her competence threatened his sense of authority, or when her intelligence was applied to something he was invested in not knowing. The first child came in 1810. A daughter, Eleanor, healthy and loud, and everything a first child should be. Abigail's pregnancy had been difficult 7 months of illness that she had managed with gritted teeth, and the practical determination that characterized everything she did, and the birth itself had been the kind of ordeal that women speak of only to other women who have been through it in the coded language of the survived. She had recovered, fully or nearly. Enough to manage the house and the accounts and the second pregnancy that followed in 1813. But Nathaniel had watched the difficulty of it and drawn the wrong conclusions. He had looked at his wife thinner than she had been, quieter, with exhaustion, wearing practical clothes instead of the fashionable ones she had abandoned as impractical, and he had seen diminishment where there was in fact transformation, and he had not had the self-knowledge to understand the difference. He had said nothing at first. That was the particular cruelty of it, not a sudden cruelty, but a quiet incremental one, the kind that happens in the accumulation of small choices. He had stopped consulting her on the shipping accounts. He had begun making dinner engagements without asking her schedule. He had started at gatherings to introduce her by name alone, without the remarks about her intelligence and capability that he had once offered with genuine pride. Small subtractions. Each one defensible in isolation. She had noticed every one of them. She had not said so for a long time because the woman Abigail was the practical, clear-eyed, unsentimental woman she had been since her father's Saturday afternoon ledger sessions, understood that pointing to small cruelties before you have collected enough of them to demonstrate a pattern is a losing proposition. People will tell you that you are oversensitive. They will tell you that you are imagining things. And if the person you are pointing to is a man whose public standing is good and whose manner in company is warm, they will tell you these things with the absolute certainty of people who have not been watching from inside the same house. So she had watched, and she had waited, and she had kept working. Selina Vale had arrived in Richmond's social orbit in the spring of 1814. She was the widow of a merchant who had died of fever in Georgia, left with a small income, excellent manners, and the kind of beauty that Richmond's professional class found simultaneously aspirational and threatening. She had a gift for making powerful men feel perceptive, which is different from flattery and considerably more effective. She had identified Nathaniel within 3 months of her arrival and approached the friendship with the patience of a woman who understood that the most durable traps are the ones the quarry walks into slowly of their own considered choice. Nathaniel had not thought of it as a trap. He had thought of it as a friendship that became an admiration, that became by degrees. He had not sufficiently examined something he did not allow himself to name directly, but which everyone in Richmond's social circle had named with considerable specificity since the previous fall. What he did not know, what he had no reason to suspect, because he had long since stopped crediting Abigail with the capacity to surprise him, was that Selina Vale was not simply a charming widow who had caught his attention at the wrong moment in his marriage. She was Silas Pembroke's cousin. They had known each other since childhood. And the arrangement between them, Selina keeping Nathaniel occupied and emotionally dependent, while Silas systematically stripped the estate of its liquidity through false accounts and manufactured debts, had been operational for nearly 2 years before Abigail found the first discrepancy in a late September ledger entry that did not match the corresponding bank receipt. Abigail had not known about Selina's connection to Pembroke when she found that first entry. She had simply noticed that the numbers were wrong, which was something she noticed the way other people noticed a door left ajar automatically without effort, because her attention had always moved toward discrepancy, the way water moves toward low ground. She had spent 2 weeks thinking she had made an error herself. She had checked the entry 6 times. Then she had pulled the corresponding ledger from the prior quarter and found 3 more entries that did not reconcile. Then she had requested through the household account she managed independently copies of the relevant bank records under the terms of her marriage settlement, which granted her access to estate financial documents, a provision that had been Nathaniel's lawyer's standard language, and which no one had imagined would ever actually be exercised. By November, she had a pattern. By January, she had a theory. By March, she had proof. And by April, she had discovered the connection between Selina and Pembroke through a land transfer document that bore both their names: Silas Pembroke as agent, Selina Vale as registered holder of a parcel of Harrowfield tenant land that had been sold quietly and on paper 18 months prior for a fraction of its value to a holding company that Abigail traced through 3 names to a post office box in Fredericksburg, registered to a woman named Clara Sims, who was Selina Vale's younger sister. She had sat with that document for a long time when she found it. She had felt the kind of stillness that comes after a very large thing becomes clear, not relief, not anger. Something colder and more precise than either the feeling of a woman who has confirmed the worst thing she suspected and is now purely focused on what to do about it. She had done something about it. The ball was what she had done about it. And now it was done, and Harrowfield's accounts were protected, and Silas Pembroke was in county custody, and Selina Vale's name was finished in Richmond social circles with a thoroughness that money could not repair and connections could not reverse. And Nathaniel Harrow was standing in a governor's ballroom with his wife's wedding ring in his fist, trying to understand how the world had rearranged itself so completely in the span of 20 minutes. Yeah, he came home at midnight. Abigail was still awake. Not waiting, she had stopped waiting for him sometime in the prior year, had stopped listening for his carriage, and tracking his return with the anxious attention that was love's least dignified expression. She was simply awake because sleep had not come yet, and she was sitting at her writing desk in her dressing gown, with the lamp low and the cedar box closed beside her. She heard the front door. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavier than usual, slower the footsteps of a man who is not yet sure where he is going when he reaches the top. They stopped outside her door. She waited. He knocked. He had not knocked on that door in over a year. He had simply entered when he entered at all, with the proprietary ease of a man who has forgotten that a closed door is a question. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at her, at the lamp, at the desk, at the cedar box, and something in his face acknowledged that he understood he was seeing the shape of what she had been doing while he was not paying attention, and that the shape of it was larger and more serious than he had imagined. "You should sleep," he said. It was not what he had come to say. She knew that. He knew it too. "I'm not tired," she said. He stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his evening coat, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had traveled a very long distance without moving at all. He reached into his pocket and set something on the edge of the desk nearest the door, her wedding ring catching the lamplight. He did not push it toward her. He simply placed it in the space between them and left it there. "Abigail," he started. "Not tonight, Nathaniel," she said, quietly. Without anger, which she knew confused him more than anger would have. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Did you know about Selina? Before, did you know what she and Pembroke—" "Yes," Abigail said. "For about 3 months." His breath came out slowly. "And you said nothing to me." "I said nothing to you," she confirmed. "Because I needed the evidence complete before I said anything to anyone, and because—" She stopped. Then she continued, because she had decided a long time ago that the one thing she would not do ever was lie to make a situation more comfortable. "Because by the time I knew the full extent of it, Nathaniel, I was not certain that telling you privately would have changed anything. I was not certain you would have believed me over them." The silence that followed was long and honest and painful in the way that only true things can be painful. He did not tell her she was wrong. That was the thing she would remember later in the months that followed, when she turned the evening over in her mind, the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. He did not tell her she was wrong. He picked up the ring from the desk, and he turned it in his fingers, and he looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back down, and he walked out of the room, and he closed the door behind him gently, which was perhaps the most careful thing he had done in years. Abigail looked at the ring. She did not pick it up. She opened the cedar box, and she put the ring inside next to the folded note, and she closed the lid, and she turned the lamp down until it went out, and she sat in the summer dark of her own room, and she listened to the house breathe around her, and she thought about what came next. There was a great deal that came next. She already knew most of it. She had been planning it for a long time, the way a woman plans when she has learned that the only person she can fully rely on to protect what matters is herself. She was, if nothing else, very good at planning. The morning after the governor's ball, Harrowfield Estate woke up differently. Not loudly, not with the dramatic rupture that the previous evening might have suggested. It woke the way things wake after a storm has passed. Quiet, altered with the particular stillness of a world that has rearranged itself overnight, and is not yet sure of its new shape. Abigail was at her desk before the sun was fully up. She had slept 3 hours, which was enough. She had learned in the years of managing 2 children and an estate that her husband increasingly left to others that the body adapts to what it must, and that 3 hours of honest sleep is more useful than 8 hours of the kind that comes with worry riding alongside it. She was dressed, her hair pinned back with the efficiency of a woman who has no patience for the purely decorative, and she was writing a letter to her father's former solicitor in Fredericksburg, a man named Alden Moore, 70 years old and recently retired, who had handled her father's estate with a precision and loyalty that had never once wavered. She was writing to ask about property. Not Harrowfield, her own property, the Whitaker land outside Fredericksburg that had passed to her on her father's death 3 years ago. 40 acres of good Virginia farmland with a house on it that had been leased to a tenant family for the past 2 years. The lease was renewable in September. She was thinking about September with a great deal of attention. Ruth brought coffee without being asked, set it at the edge of the desk without disturbing the papers, and left again. That was the kind of service that could not be taught and could not be hired. It was the product of years of mutual attention between 2 women who had figured out how to occupy the same household with honesty and without pretense. And Abigail was aware, as she was aware of most things she valued, that it was not a small thing. She was on her second page when she heard Nathaniel's door. His footsteps went down the hall, not toward her room, down the stairs, through to the back of the house where the kitchen was. She heard Dora's voice, brief, flat, without the warmth it usually carried, and then silence, and then the sound of the side door. He had gone out. Good. She needed the morning. She finished the letter, sealed it, wrote the address in her small, precise hand, and added it to the stack of correspondence on the left side of her desk. Then she pulled the next document toward her. This one was not a letter. It was the county court filing that Mr. Trent had prepared for her review, the formal complaint against Silas Pembroke, which named the specific statutes violated under Virginia property law, cited the forged documents by date and account number, and included a list of 14 witnesses, most of them tenant farmers, who had paid their rents in full, and watched those payments vanish from the official records. She read it carefully. She made 2 small corrections in the margins. She would return it to Trent by noon. She was halfway through the second page when Eleanor appeared in the doorway. Eleanor was 6 years old, which meant she was at the age of pure, unfiltered perception, old enough to understand that something had shifted in the house, not old enough to have learned the social mechanisms that adults use to paper over shifts with normalcy. She stood in the doorway in her nightgown, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked at her mother with the specific searching look that she had inherited from Abigail, directly the look that went straight past surface to what was actually true. "Mama," she said, "is Papa in trouble?" Abigail set down her pen. "Come here, sweetheart." Eleanor came. Abigail turned from the desk and settled her daughter onto her knee, and held her the way she had held her since she was an infant, with both arms fully without reservation, the one kind of love in the house that had never been conditional or complicated. "Papa made some mistakes," Abigail said. "Some of them are being fixed now. That's what the men who came to the house last week were helping with. Mr. Trent, he has a very serious face." "He does. It's useful for his work." Eleanor considered this. "Are you and Papa going to argue?" "I don't plan to argue with anyone," Abigail said, which was the truth in both its meanings. She had moved past the phase of this that involved argument. What came next was quieter and more final than argument. "Dora made biscuits," Eleanor said, deciding in the way of 6-year-olds that the situation had been sufficiently understood and could now be set aside in favor of more immediate concerns. "Then you should go have some before your brother eats them all." Eleanor slid off her knee and disappeared down the hall with the purposeful speed of a child on a biscuit mission. Abigail watched the empty doorway for a moment and then turned back to her desk. She picked up her pen. She finished the second page. Nathaniel returned from his morning walk an hour later and went directly to the estate office, which was on the ground floor at the back of the house, separated from the main family rooms by a narrow corridor. This had been Silas Pembroke's primary working space for 11 years. The desk in the center of the room still had Pembroke's ledger books stacked on the left side, the official ones, the ones that had been presented to Nathaniel each quarter, with the smooth confidence of a man who understood that his employer was not going to check the numbers himself. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of that office for a long time without going in. He had trusted Silas Pembroke with everything. Not out of carelessness, or not entirely out of carelessness. He had trusted him because Pembroke had come with his father's recommendation, had worked the estate for 3 years before Nathaniel took over, and had possessed from the beginning the particular quality of competent men who do not make you feel foolish for not understanding things they handle for you. He had answered every question Nathaniel asked. He had simply made very sure that Nathaniel never asked the right ones. The right ones had been Abigail's. They had always been Abigail's. He went into the office. He sat at the desk. He opened the topmost ledger, one of Abigail's working copies, which Trent had returned to the estate yesterday morning, before the ball now annotated in her handwriting, with small precise notes in the margins, and he began to read. He read for 4 hours. He did not come out for lunch. He did not send for anyone. He simply sat in that room with the evidence of 4 years of systematic theft laid out in his wife's handwriting, and he read every page, and he let it be what it was. At 2 in the afternoon, he put his face in his hands. At 2:15, he got up, went to the door of the office, and told the young houseman stationed in the corridor to find Thomas Vance at the First Virginia banking house and ask him to come to Harrowfield at his earliest convenience. Then he went back to the desk and kept reading. Word reached Selina Vale at her rented rooms on Carey Street by mid-morning, carried by 3 different women in 3 different forms. A note, a visit, and a servant dispatched by a mutual acquaintance who could not wait for a more dignified channel. The accounts were consistent. The solicitor had filed. The bankers had confirmed. Pembroke was in county custody, and Abigail Whittaker Harrow, who had been dismissed by Richmond society for the better part of 2 years as a tired, unfashionable wife of no particular consequence, had apparently been managing the entire exposure for the better part of 6 months with a patience and thoroughness that the ladies of Richmond were already discussing in terms that ranged from admiration to outright awe. Selina read the note. She received the visit. She listened to the servant. Then she dismissed everyone and sat alone in her parlor and thought clearly which was what she did best when things went badly. She needed a lawyer. Not Trent, he was Abigail's man. Not anyone in Richmond's established circle, which would be closed to her now in ways that would take time to fully map, but which she understood instinctively to be comprehensive. She needed someone in another county, someone who owed her nothing socially, and who would therefore approach her situation as a purely legal matter. She wrote 2 letters. She burned the first one after reading it over because it admitted too much in its attempt to explain. The second was shorter and said only that she required counsel on a property matter and named a figure for consultation fees that she hoped would ensure speed. She sealed it, addressed it to a solicitor in Petersburg she had used once years ago before Richmond, when her late husband's estate had required navigation, and she gave it to her housemaid to post. Then she sat back in her chair and did the calculation she had been avoiding since the moment she had seen Abigail Whittaker at the top of that staircase. The land transfers would be the most serious exposure. Her name was on 2 documents. Silas had assured her that the chain of holding companies was sufficient insulation, that if anything went wrong, the Sims connection could be managed quietly, that Clara's involvement would not be traceable. He had been wrong. Abigail had traced it, which meant that either Silas had been less careful than he'd claimed, or Abigail was considerably more capable than anyone had given her credit for. Both things Selina suspected were true. She thought about Nathaniel. She thought about the way he had looked when he saw her at the ball. Not the look of a man seeing the woman he had chosen, but the look of a man suddenly seeing two things at once and understanding for the first time that they were not compatible. She had been watching his face across the room when Abigail placed the ring in his hand, and she had seen something move through him that she did not have a clean name for, but that she recognized instinctively as the end of something. She was not. She told herself hurt by this. She was practical. She had always been practical. She had come to Richmond with a plan and a set of resources, and she had executed the plan, and the plan had failed, and now the practical matter was damage containment. She told herself this several more times over the course of the afternoon. By evening, she had almost come to believe it. What Selina did not know, what no one outside of a small circle knew yet, was that Abigail's documentation had uncovered something beyond the Pembroke theft. Something that Abigail herself had found 3 weeks prior, and had not yet fully decided what to do with. She sat with it again that afternoon after the children's supper, and after she had confirmed with Ruth that the evening could be managed without her direct supervision. She went back to her desk, and she opened a separate folder, smaller than the estate files, bound with red ribbon rather than black. Inside were 6 letters. Not business correspondence. Personal letters written in a hand she recognized as Pembroke's compact, precise, the hand of a man who had written a great many things he intended to be persuasive, and addressed not to Selina, but to a man named William Geary. Geary was a county land commissioner. He was the man responsible for authorizing the registration of land transfers in the county records. He was also, as the letters made very clear, a man who had been receiving monthly payments from an account held in a name Abigail had traced through 2 steps back to Pembroke, a county commissioner on Pembroke's payroll. It meant the land transfers had not merely been recorded through a compromised chain of holding companies. They had been authorized by the official who was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of fraud. It meant Pembroke had not simply been stealing from Harrowfield. He had been operating with institutional cover, and it meant that when Trent filed the complaint, as he had done yesterday, Geary would be among the first people informed, because complaints of this nature in Virginia in 1816 were routed through the county commissioner's office. Abigail had known this when she let Trent file. She had calculated it with the same cool precision she brought to every column of figures, and she had made a decision. She had not given Trent the letters about Geary. Not yet. She had kept them. She had been waiting to see what Geary did when the complaint arrived on his desk. She did not have to wait long. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, a rider came to Harrowfield with a message. Not for Nathaniel, for her. Addressed to Mrs. Harrow, in a formal hand she did not recognize with the county commissioner's seal on the outer flap. She opened it. She read it. She read it a second time. Then she sent for Mr. Trent. Trent arrived within the hour. He was the kind of man who moved fast when the situation called for it, and who had the self-discipline not to let urgency show on his face until he understood exactly what he was being urgent about. Abigail handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His expression did not change during the reading. When he finished, he folded it along its original crease, and he set it on the desk, and he looked at her. "He's proposing to delay the filing," Trent said. "He's proposing to lose the filing," Abigail said. "There is a difference." The letter from William Geary had been on its surface, a procedural communication. A notification that the complaint filed by Caleb Trent on behalf of Harrowfield Estate required additional documentation before it could be formally accepted into the county record, citing a provision of Virginia property statute that required corroboration of financial damages by a registered county assessor before fraud charges of this nature could proceed. It was written in the measured language of bureaucratic obstruction, the kind of language designed to look like process and function as delay. "He has 30 days to certify the assessor," Abigail said. "In 30 days, Pembroke's counsel will have had time to file counter-documentation. Selina Vale will have had time to move assets, and the land transfer records that currently show forged authorization will have passed through 2 more layers of county record that Geary controls." She folded her hands on the desk. "He is betting that I don't know what he is." "And the letters?" Trent asked. "I have 6. She opened the red ribbon folder and placed it in front of him. Monthly payments for 14 months. His account Geary's receipt. The first one predates the initial fraudulent land transfer by 3 weeks. Trent opened the folder. He went very still in the way he had gone still at their first meeting 3 weeks ago, when she had laid the Pembroke accounts in front of him, the stillness of a man who is looking at something that changes the size of the problem considerably. "This makes Geary a co-conspirator," he said. "That was my reading. It also means the complaint cannot go through the county commissioner's office. We need to escalate directly to the circuit court." He looked up. "Judge Harlan in Henrico County. He is not a man with patience for corrupt land transfers. He has ruled on 2 cases of this nature in the past 5 years. Can we file directly? With these letters? Yes." He closed the folder carefully. "But Mrs. Harrow, once we do this, Geary will know within hours. He will move to protect himself, which means he will attempt to distance himself from Pembroke as fast as possible. That may cause complications in the Pembroke case itself if Geary's testimony becomes necessary." "I thought of that," Abigail said. "Which is why I would like to file this afternoon before the close of business, while Geary still believes I only know about Pembroke." She met Trent's eyes steadily. He should not be given tonight to make arrangements. Trent looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of the person across the desk from him. Then he picked up his hat. "I can have the filing prepared in 2 hours," he said. "You have the originals." "Sealed and logged as you asked." "Then go," she said. "And Mr. Trent, take the back road out. Geary has men who watch this house. He has had them watching since yesterday evening." Trent paused at the door. "You know about the men." "I counted 2 this morning," she said. Ruth counted 3. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Mrs. Harrow, I have practiced law in this state for 22 years. I have worked with a great many clients in a great many complicated situations." He stopped. "I cannot recall a single one who had read the situation more clearly or planned more carefully." "Thank you," she said. "Please hurry." He left. Abigail listened to his footsteps cross the hall and the sound of the front door, and then she turned back to her desk and she began writing her second letter of the day to Alden Moore in Fredericksburg. This one asking not about lease renewals, but about the process for formally separating her inherited property from her marital estate under Virginia law. She was not leaving yet. There were things that needed finishing first, but September, she had decided, was a reasonable target.
Chamata.
The news of the circuit court filing reached Richmond society the next morning, delivered in fragments across the breakfast tables of a dozen households. Simultaneously, the way significant news always travels not through one channel, but through all of them at once. Each fragment slightly different. Each household adjusting the story slightly to accommodate their prior understanding of the principles involved. What was consistent across all versions was this. The complaint against Silas Pembroke had been escalated to the Henrico Circuit Court, bypassing the county commissioner's office. William Geary's name appeared in the supporting documentation. And the filing had been made late in the afternoon of the day following the governor's ball, which meant that Abigail Harrow had had the documentation ready before the ball had appeared at the ball, with full knowledge of what would follow, and had managed the entire sequence with a composure that Richmond's social circle was finding increasingly impossible to dismiss. The women talked first. They always did, and they were more accurate than the men who tended to lead with the financial dimensions of the story and arrive at the human dimensions later after the women had already mapped them thoroughly. Mrs. Caroline Aldridge, wife of the banker, a sharp and warm-hearted woman who had known Abigail mildly for 3 years, without fully appreciating what she was looking at, told her Tuesday morning sewing circle that she had watched Abigail cross that ballroom and felt for the first time in a long time that she had witnessed something genuinely new. She wasn't performing, Caroline said. That's what I kept thinking. Every woman I know in that room, when they walk into a difficult situation, they're performing something, courage or composure or righteous anger, whatever the moment seems to call for. She wasn't performing anything. She was just there, entirely herself. One of the other women in the circle, a Mrs. Hollis, whose husband had done business with Pembroke 3 years prior and was consequently following the legal developments with a personal anxiety she was managing through the medium of elaborate embroidery, said, "I heard she paid the loan defaults herself, from her own account." "She did," said Caroline. George confirmed it, "And he—" Mrs. Hollis lowered her voice, which was unnecessary since they were all leaning in already. "And Nathaniel Harrow didn't know she'd done it." "He didn't know any of it," Caroline said. "George said he came to the bank yesterday afternoon with Thomas Vance and went through the full account history. He sat there for 2 hours. He barely spoke." The room absorbed this. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed the silence of women who are processing the particular species of tragedy that involves a man failing to see what was directly in front of him until the cost of not seeing it became unsurvivable. "She should leave him," said a younger woman near the window, the wife of a junior merchant new to the circle and not yet trained in the social protocols that governed how directly you could say true things in a group of near strangers. No one corrected her. Nathaniel did not know about the circuit court filing until Thomas Vance told him. Vance came to Harrowfield at 6 in the evening, as Nathaniel had requested that morning, and they sat in the estate office among Pembroke's ledgers and Abigail's annotated copies. And Vance laid out the full financial picture with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that his client needed to understand everything and was only now in a position to hear it. The total amount misappropriated was substantial, more than Nathaniel had estimated, even after his 4 hours with the ledgers that morning. The land transfers represented the most serious long-term damage. 3 parcels that had been sold through fraudulent instruments to entities controlled by Pembroke and Selina would need to be contested in court, and the outcome was not guaranteed because the transfers, fraudulent as they were, had been recorded by the county commissioner's office. "Had been recorded," Vance said. "That changes today." He explained the circuit court filing. He explained Geary. He explained the letters. Nathaniel sat across from him and listened without interrupting, which took considerable effort because what he was hearing was a second layer of revelation beneath the first. Not just that his estate had been robbed and his wife had stopped it, but that his wife had identified a conspiracy. Within the conspiracy, had held evidence of official corruption for 3 weeks while assessing how to use it most effectively, and had moved with such precise timing that Geary had received the circuit court filing before he had time to act on the county-level knowledge he had received from Trent's original filing that morning. "She outmaneuvered a county commissioner," Nathaniel said when Vance finished. "She outmaneuvered a county commissioner and a 14-month financial fraud simultaneously." "Yes," Vance said. He paused. "Nathaniel, I have been in banking for 19 years. The analysis she brought to my office 6 weeks ago was—" He stopped choosing his words. "There are men I have worked with for a decade who would not have caught what she caught, and the manner in which she documented it, sequenced it, anticipated the legal complications." "I know," Nathaniel said. Vance looked at him. "Do you?" "I knew when I married her," Nathaniel said. He said it quietly, and it was the most honest thing he had said in longer than he could measure. "I knew what she was. I stopped looking." Vance said nothing. He gathered his papers. He stood, picked up his hat, and then he paused at the door of the estate office. "The loan defaults she covered," he said. "The 3 parcels. That money came entirely from her father's estate held under the Whitaker account. She is within her legal rights to request repayment from Harrowfield's accounts once the criminal proceedings resolve." He met Nathaniel's eyes. "I would expect her to request it." "She should," Nathaniel said. "She's entitled to it." "Yes," Vance said. "She is." He settled his hat on his head. Good evening." He left, and Nathaniel sat alone in the office where his estate manager had stolen from him for 4 years, and he picked up the nearest of Abigail's annotated copies, and he looked at her handwriting in the margins, small, precise, patient page after page of careful work done in the small hours of the night, while he had been elsewhere not looking, and he sat with the weight of that for a long time. At 8 o'clock that evening, Abigail received a second visitor she had not expected. Not Nathaniel. She heard him in the office and had no intention of going down. The visitor came to the front door, and Ruth brought the card up with an expression that Abigail read immediately as complicated. The card read, "Miss Selina Vale." Abigail looked at it for a moment, then she said, "Send her up." Ruth's expression deepened into something that clearly wanted to say, "Are you certain?" but had enough respect for its mistress's judgment to say only, "Yes, ma'am." Selina came in without pretense, which was, Abigail thought, at least something. She had changed from the previous evening's ivory gown into a traveling dress, dark blue practical, with a small trunk behind her that suggested she had made arrangements for the night that did not involve her Carey Street rooms. She looked for the first time in Abigail's experience of watching her entirely, like what she was, a woman who had played a complicated game and lost it, and who had come to acknowledge the loss directly, rather than manage it sideways. She stood in the center of the room, and she looked at Abigail, and she said, "I came to tell you that the land in Clara's name, my sister. I want you to know she did not understand the full extent of what Silas was doing. She thought it was a business arrangement, a legitimate one." "I know," Abigail said. Selina blinked. Your sister's correspondence with the holding company was consistent with someone operating at the surface level of the arrangement, Abigail said. She received instructions and followed them. She did not generate them. I have not included her in the filing. Selina stood very still. Something moved through her face, not relief exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has braced for a blow that does not come, and finds the absence of it almost harder to absorb than the blow itself would have been. "Why?" she said. "Because she's not guilty of what Pembroke is guilty of," Abigail said. "And because punishing the wrong people is not what this was for." Selina looked at her for a long, strange moment. Then she said very quietly, "I thought you were nothing." "I know," Abigail said. "Nathaniel said—" Selina stopped. "He never spoke of you unkindly, that is the truth. He never spoke of you as someone who mattered, as someone who was present." "That is unkindness," Abigail said. "It simply wears better clothes than the other kind." Selina had nothing to say to that. She picked up her gloves from where she had folded them over her arm, and she turned toward the door. Then she stopped without turning back, and she said, "He doesn't deserve you." "No," Abigail agreed. "He doesn't." Selina left. Her footsteps went down the stairs, and through the front hall, and out the door, and then the sound of a carriage, and then nothing. Abigail sat at her desk for a long time after that. Not writing, not reading, just sitting with the quiet of the house, and the particular feeling of a woman who has reached the end of the part of the story that required combat, and is standing now at the beginning of the part that requires something harder. The letters to Fredericksburg were sealed on the left side of the desk. The red ribbon folder was locked in the bottom drawer. The cedar box was closed. Outside it was still summer. The heat pressed against the window glass with the patient insistence of a season that had no intention of releasing its hold on the world just yet. Somewhere below, she heard Nathaniel's footsteps cross the estate office floor, stop, cross back. A man walking circles in a room that no longer felt like his. She thought about September. She thought about 40 acres and a house and tenant farmers who paid their rents honestly. She thought about Eleanor's serious eyes and James and his dramatic spiders, and what it would mean to raise them somewhere that smelled less like pretense and more like ground. She opened her writing desk drawer, and she took out a clean sheet of paper, and she began the letter she had been composing in her head for 3 weeks. Not to Moore, not to Trent, not to anyone involved in the legal machinery that was now, without requiring any further intervention from her, turning steadily toward justice. This letter was to herself. A kind of accounting. a list of what she was taking when she left and what she was leaving behind. She wrote for an hour. When she was finished, she folded the paper and did not address it to anyone, and set it in the cedar box next to the ring and the note. 3 things in that box now. Enough to know the shape of what had happened. Enough to remember it clearly. She closed the lid. The circuit court filing landed in Henrico County on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon it had done what Abigail had calculated it would do. It had made the situation irreversible. Judge Harlan's clerk logged the complaint at 2:30. By 4 o'clock, 2 county deputies had arrived at William Geary's office with a court order freezing his authority to process any land transfer documentation in the affected county records pending investigation. Geary had been at his desk when they arrived. His secretary said later that he had read the court order twice, set it down with the careful movements of a man who understood that any sudden motion might be interpreted as something other than compliance, and asked for 10 minutes to send a personal message before he accompanied the deputies. The message, intercepted by Trent's arrangement with the courier office, was addressed to a law firm in Petersburg. It was 3 sentences long and asked for immediate representation. It confirmed everything. Trent brought Abigail the intercepted copy that evening. She read it, noted that it matched her expectations precisely, and filed it in the red ribbon folder alongside the 6 letters. "The circuit court will move quickly," Trent said. "Judge Harlan has no patience for land fraud. He will want both Pembroke and Geary before him within 30 days. "And the land transfers themselves?" Abigail asked. "The 3 contested parcels are frozen pending the outcome. If the court rules in Harrowfield's favor, and with this documentation, Mrs. Harrow, I do not anticipate a different outcome. The transfers will be voided, and the land reverts to the estate. The loan defaults I covered. Repayable to your Whitaker account from estate funds once the criminal proceedings close." Trent paused. "Nathaniel has already signed the repayment authorization. He came to my office this morning." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "He did not tell me that. He asked me not to," Trent said. "He said, he stopped the way careful men stop when they are not sure whether delivering a message serves the person they are delivering it to." Then he continued, because she was looking at him with the patient clarity that made evasion feel like an insult. "He said it was the least he owed you, and that he preferred you hear it from the record rather than from him, because he did not want you to feel that he was using it to ask for something." Abigail said nothing for a moment. She looked at the middle distance with the expression of a woman filing information in the precise internal ledger where she kept things that mattered and required time. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Trent." He left. She sat with that particular piece of information for longer than she sat with most things. Nathaniel moved through the following days with the deliberate, careful movements of a man who has understood that he is on extremely thin ground and that the worst thing he can do is pretend otherwise. He did not attempt to speak to Abigail at length. He did not make appeals or arguments. He ate his meals when they were served, spent his mornings in the estate office working through the financial reconstruction that Vance had outlined for him, and managed the household with a quiet, diminished competence that was new and to the staff deeply disorienting. Dora noticed first. She noticed because she was the kind of woman who paid attention to what people ate and used it to read the interior weather with an accuracy that no formal instrument could have matched. Nathaniel had always eaten with the confidence of a man who expected good food as a basic condition of his existence. Now he ate carefully, quietly, without the expansive commentary on what was excellent and what was merely adequate that had been his lifelong habit at the table. "He's grieving," Dora told Ruth in the kitchen, in a voice low enough that the distinction between conversation and thinking out loud was not entirely clear. "He ought to be," Ruth said. "That ain't what I meant," Dora said. "I meant he knows it. That's new. He's sitting with it." Ruth considered this. She and Dora had been having conversations of this precise nature for years. Conversations that were also assessments, that were also, in their way, a kind of loyalty to the woman they both served. A continuous monitoring of the household's emotional weather on Abigail's behalf. "It may be too late for sitting with it to matter," Ruth said. "Maybe," Dora agreed. But I've seen men not sit with it at all. I've seen men go straight from caught to defended without stopping. He ain't doing that." She paused over the bread she was shaping. "Don't know what it means. Just noticed." On the 6th day after the ball, Beatrice Harrow came back to Harrowfield. She had not been to the house since the morning before the ball, when she had come to ride in Abigail's carriage, and her return now was deliberate and announced she sent a note ahead, which she had not always done in the years when she had considered the house as much hers as her son's, and the formality of the note was itself a message about how she understood the current arrangement of things. She came in the mid-morning. Abigail met her in the front parlor. They sat across from each other with tea between them and the summer heat pressing at the windows. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some situations require that the participants first simply acknowledge to each other that they are in them before anything useful can be said. "How are the children?" Beatrice asked. "Well," Abigail said, "Eleanor has decided she wants to learn to keep accounts. She asked me yesterday to show her how the columns work." Something moved through Beatrice's face, not quite a smile, but its close cousin. Of course she did. "James wants a horse. He has wanted a horse since he was 4, and I expect he will want one until he has one, and then he will want a larger one. He is exactly like his grandfather in that respect," Beatrice said. "Edmund Harrow wanted a larger horse from the age of 6 until the day he died." They were quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, warmer, the quiet of two women who have known each other long enough to share a silence without filling it. "I came to ask what you need," Beatrice said. "Not what Nathaniel needs, not what the estate needs. What you need." Abigail looked at her. "I've written to Mr. Moore in Fredericksburg about the Whittaker property." Beatrice's expression did not change, but her hands folded in her lap tightened slightly. "You're planning to leave." "I'm planning to have options," Abigail said. "Which is what I should have done 10 years ago, but I was younger, and I believed in things I have since had reason to revise." "He knows he failed you." "Yes," Abigail said. "I believe he does. That doesn't change what the failing was." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She picked up her tea and held it and looked at Abigail with the direct, uncomplicated regard of a woman who has lived long enough to be done with indirection. "I did not raise him to become what he became in these last years. I want you to know that. Not as an excuse for him. There is no excuse, but because I need you to know that I see it clearly. What he did to you, not just the public parts, the daily parts, the small, steady diminishments. I see those too." Abigail held her gaze. "That means something to me," she said. "It genuinely does." "Good." Beatrice set her tea down. "Then let me also say this. I am not here to ask you to stay. I am not here to argue for the marriage, or for my son's redemption, or for any version of the future that requires you to sacrifice more than you already have." She paused. "I am here because you are the mother of my grandchildren, and because you have shown more courage and more intelligence in the past 6 months than anyone in this family has shown in 20 years. And I intend to make very sure that whatever happens next, you know that you have my support without conditions attached." Abigail breathed in slowly. She had not until this moment fully understood how much she had needed to hear exactly that from exactly this woman. She had managed everything alone for so long. The evidence, the strategy, the legal filings, the sleepless ledger work, that the notion of support had come to feel theoretical, something she noted the absence of without expecting its arrival. "Thank you, Beatrice," she said. It was the first time she had used the name without the social prefix, and both women noticed it, and neither of them remarked on it. Beatrice picked up her tea again. "Now, tell me about the Whittaker property. How much acreage is the house sound?" And they talked practically and specifically about 40 acres and a house and the September lease and what a woman needed to build something that was entirely her own. They talked for 2 hours. When Beatrice left, she embraced Abigail at the door briefly, firmly, the embrace of a woman who means what she does, and she walked down the front steps and into her carriage without looking back. Abigail stood in the doorway and watched her go, and felt for the first time since before the ball something that was not strategy or endurance or careful management of her own emotions. She felt quietly, and without drama, grateful. The twist came on a Wednesday 11 days after the ball, and it came from a direction Abigail had not mapped. She was in her study when Ruth brought her a card. Not a social card, a business card, plain white with black lettering for a firm of solicitors in Philadelphia. The name on it was Hargrove and Coles. Below the firm name in handwriting was a single line. Regarding the estate of Edmund Whittaker deceased. Matter of significant urgency. Abigail read the card twice. Her father had been dead 3 years. His estate had been settled by Moore in Fredericksburg without complication. She had received the Whittaker land and a cash sum, and that had been the entirety of it. There was nothing remaining to settle. She told Ruth to send the man up. He was young, younger than she had expected from the formal card, perhaps 28, with the careful posture of someone newly established in a profession that rewards confidence and who is still finding the exact posture that projects it. His name was Coles, the junior partner evidently, and he sat across from her desk with a leather satchel on his knee, and the particular expression of a man who is about to deliver information he is not entirely sure how it will be received. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "I appreciate your time. I'll be direct because the matter is time-sensitive, and I believe you prefer directness." He opened the satchel. "Are you aware that your father maintained a secondary account with the Philadelphia Trading House?" She was not. She said so. The account was opened in 1801 under the name Whittaker Trading Company, separate from his primary merchant accounts. He used it primarily for commodity investments, cotton futures primarily, and some shipping insurance premiums. The account was not included in the estate settlement because at the time of his death it carried a significant outstanding loan against it, rendering it technically in deficit. He placed a document on her desk. The loan has now been repaid by the returns on investments that Mr. Whittaker had structured before his death to continue generating income for exactly this purpose. The deficit is cleared. The account as of this past April is in surplus. Abigail looked at the document. She looked at the figure at the bottom. She looked up at Coles. "This is my father's account. The estate settlement did not include it because of the deficit. But as sole heir under his will, the account reverts to you now that the deficit is cleared. Our firm has been administering it since his death per his instructions, which were to settle the loan from investment returns before notifying the heir." Coles paused. "He was, from what I understand, a very deliberate man." "He was," Abigail said quietly. She looked at the figure again. It was not a small figure. It was, in fact, the kind of figure that meant the Whittaker land in Fredericksburg was not the limit of her options. It meant she had considerably more room than she had calculated. She pressed her hands flat on the desk, a gesture she made when she needed to feel something solid while she thought. Her father had done this. He had structured it this way on purpose. The investment returns settling the debt, the account reverting only once it was clear and healthy. He had known she would need it at some point. He had not known when. He had simply made sure it would be there. "You're all right, ma'am?" Coles asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine." She looked at him. "What do I need to sign?" "None change." She did not tell Nathaniel about the Philadelphia account that day, or the next. She needed to sit with it first, to let the change in the landscape of her own future settle fully into her understanding before she made any decisions based on it. She told Ruth, because Ruth would need to know if arrangements changed, and because Ruth had earned the right to know things before they happened rather than after. Ruth's response was characteristic. She looked at the figure Abigail wrote on a slip of paper, looked at Abigail and said, "Your father was a thorough man." "He was." "He knew you'd need an exit." "He knew I might," Abigail said. "He hoped I wouldn't. He planned as though I would." Ruth nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to think," Abigail said. "And then I'm going to decide. And then I'm going to act, in that order." She looked at Ruth steadily. "I'm not making any decisions while I'm still inside the middle of everything. Things are still moving. They were. The circuit court proceedings were scheduled. Pembroke's lawyer had filed 3 counter-motions, all of which Trent had characterized as delay tactics that would not survive Harlan's scrutiny. Geary had retained the Petersburg firm and was by all accounts preparing to cooperate with the court in exchange for reduced charges, which Trent had also anticipated, and which would, he said, actually strengthen the case against Pembroke by adding an official witness to the conspiracy structure. And Nathaniel quietly and without announcement had begun doing something that Abigail had not expected. He had started talking to the tenants. She found out through Dora, who found out through her sister's husband, who farmed the eastern parcel, and had been one of the 14 witnesses in Trent's original filing. Nathaniel had ridden out to the tenant farms 4 days after the ball alone without Pembroke's replacement, or any estate official, and he had gone to each household and sat down with the farmer and his wife, and he had told them directly that he understood the records had shown their payments missing, and that this was not their fault, and that the estate acknowledged every payment they had made and would ensure the records reflected it accurately. He had brought written acknowledgments signed by Vance confirming the corrected account status. He had delivered them himself. Abigail heard this and sat with it. She did not know what to do with it, so she did what she always did with things she did not yet know what to do with. She put it in the part of her mind that continued working on problems while the rest of her attended to other matters. And she waited. She was in the kitchen with Dora on the morning of the 12th day when Nathaniel came in. Not to the kitchen specifically. He had not come into the kitchen voluntarily in years. It was not the kind of space he had thought to occupy, but he came to the doorway, and he stopped there, and he looked at Abigail with an expression she had not seen on his face in a very long time. "Trent sent word," he said. "Geary has agreed to full cooperation. The circuit court hearing is set for the 14th of next month." "I know," Abigail said. "He sent me word as well." Nathaniel nodded. He did not move from the doorway. He had developed in the past 12 days a habit of stopping at thresholds, doorways, the edge of a room, the top of the stairs, as though he had learned to ask permission from the space before he entered it. It was, she thought, the right instinct, even if it had arrived 12 years too late. "Abigail," he said. "Nathaniel," she said in the same register, not warning exactly, but a recognition that they were at a threshold. "I went to see the tenants," he said. "I don't know if you heard." "I heard. I should have known them. Their names. How long they'd worked the land." He stopped. "Pembroke handled everything, and I let him because it was convenient, and because I told myself it was efficient management, and not—" He stopped again. "It wasn't efficient management." "No," she said. "It wasn't. It was me not wanting to know what I'd rather not have to know," he said. It was the most plainly he had spoken to her in years, without the social coding that men of his standing used to make difficult truths sound like considered positions. It was just the thing itself stated directly. "I did that with a great deal of things." Dora, with the tact of a woman who had navigated 20 years of difficult household weather, took her bread and went to the back of the kitchen with complete apparent absorption in her task. Abigail looked at her husband across the room, and she thought about 8 years, which was not a small number, and she thought about the morning she had found the first wrong ledger entry, and the months that followed, and the long, patient, lonely work of building a case that would hold. And she thought about Eleanor, with her serious eyes asking to learn the columns, and James wanting his horse, and Ruth with 3 hours' notice counting the men watching the house. "I know you did," she said. "I know you know it now. I'm glad you know it." She held his gaze. "But Nathaniel, knowing it now doesn't undo the years when you didn't. And I can't make a decision about what comes next based on who you are this week. I've been making decisions based on evidence my whole life. I need more than 12 days. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That's fair." "I know it's fair," she said. "I'm the one who taught you about fair accounting." Something moved through his face. Not quite a smile, not quite grief. Something in between. He nodded once, and he stepped back from the doorway, and he went down the hall. Abigail turned back to the table. Dora reappeared beside her with the flour tin and the expression of a woman who has heard everything and intends to take it to her grave. "You handled that well, ma'am," Dora said. "I handled it honestly," Abigail said. "That's what I meant," Dora said, and went back to her bread.
Decade 5.
The night before the circuit court hearing, Abigail opened the cedar box. She took out the folded note unnecessary, and she read it one final time. She took out the letter she had written to herself, the accounting of what she was taking and leaving. She read that too. She took out the ring last. She set it on the desk and looked at it, the plain gold band that had been on her finger from the age of 23 to the night of the governor's ball, that had passed through her hand into his and back into this box in the space of a few weeks, that had cost nothing she valued as much as what it had represented, and nothing she grieved as purely as what it had failed to be. She put the ring back in the box. She put the note back. She put the letter back. She closed the lid. She picked up the cedar box and she carried it to the wardrobe, and she put it on the high shelf at the back behind the folded linens, where she would not see it every day. It was not a decision, not yet. But it was the beginning of the movement toward one. And Abigail Whittaker Harrow had always understood that before you could decide where you were going, you had to stop looking quite so hard at where you'd been. She went to bed. She slept for 5 hours, which was more than she had managed in weeks. And in the morning she rose before the sun, dressed in her plain work clothes, went to her desk, and began writing the first letter she had ever written to the director of the Philadelphia Trading House, in her own name, on her own authority, regarding her own account. Outside, it was still summer. It always seemed to be summer. She thought, that relentless Virginia heat that pressed and did not let up. But she had always done her best work in the heat. She had always been able to think most clearly when the rest of the world was wilting. She was not wilting. She was, if anything, only beginning. The circuit court hearing lasted 2 days. Abigail attended both of them. She sat in the second row behind Trent's table. Not the first. The first was for the legal parties, and she had no interest in theater, only in outcome. And she wore the same dark blue gown she had worn to the governor's ball, not out of sentiment, but because it was her best gown, and she believed in dressing for the weight of an occasion. Ruth had pressed it the night before without being asked. That was the kind of woman Ruth was. Judge Harlan was everything Trent had described. He was 60 years old, compact and deliberate, with the manner of a man who had spent decades listening to people try to make complicated things sound simple, and simple things sound complicated, and who had developed through that long exposure an absolute intolerance for both. He entered the courtroom on the first morning and settled into his chair and looked at the assembled parties with the calm, assessing patience of a man who has already read everything and is now watching to see whether the people in front of him will confirm or contradict what he has read. Pembroke's lawyer was a man named Forsyth, brought in from Alexandria, and he was skilled in the particular manner of lawyers who are skilled, which is to say, he was very good at making reasonable sound like insufficient. He filed 3 objections in the first hour. Harlan overruled all 3 with the quiet economy of a man who finds objections that lack merit faintly insulting but is too professional to say so. Geary testified on the first afternoon. He had the diminished, careful manner of a man who has agreed to cooperate and is now discovering that cooperation, while strategically correct, requires saying true things in public about himself that he would very much prefer to say nowhere and to no one. He confirmed the payments. He confirmed the land transfer authorizations. He confirmed that Pembroke had approached him in the spring of 1814 with what he had characterized as a straightforward business arrangement, and that he had understood by the summer of that year that it was not straightforward and had continued regardless. He said this last part looking at his hands, which Abigail thought was at least the honest posture. Trent presented the documentation on the second morning. He was methodical and thorough and entirely without drama, which was the right approach because the documents themselves contained all the drama necessary. He walked the court through the forged signatures, the fabricated invoices, the fraudulent land transfer chain, and the 14 tenant accounts that had been marked, settled in Pembroke's ledgers, while the actual payments sat in a holding account that Pembroke controlled. When Trent placed Abigail's annotated copies into the court record, the pages she had worked through in the small hours of a dozen nights with her precise handwriting in the margins, identifying each discrepancy, and its corresponding evidence. Judge Harlan picked up the first page and read it, and then looked up at Trent. "These annotations were made by Mrs. Harrow," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." Harlan looked at the page again. She found the initial discrepancy herself. She did. Harlan set the page down. He did not comment further, but something in his expression shifted in the way that things shift when a person has confirmed a suspicion they had already formed. He moved the proceedings forward without ceremony. Pembroke was convicted on 11 of the 14 counts. The 3 remaining counts were folded into Geary's cooperation agreement. The 3 contested land parcels were ordered, returned to Harrowfield Estate. Geary received a suspended sentence and a permanent ban from county office. Pembroke received 4 years. When Harlan read the verdict, Abigail did not react visibly. She sat straight in the second row, and she breathed, and she let the words settle into the permanent record of things that had happened, which was the only record that ultimately mattered. Trent turned and looked at her from the front table. She gave him a single nod. Outside the courthouse in the bright summer heat, Trent shook her hand with both of his. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. She meant more than the hearing. Nathaniel had not attended the trial. She had not asked him to, and he had not offered. This had been, she thought, the correct arrangement on both sides. His presence would have made the proceedings about their marriage, and the proceedings were not about their marriage. They were about 14 tenant farmers whose payments had been stolen, and 3 parcels of Virginia land that had been fraudulently transferred, and a county commissioner who had taken money to look the other way. That was what the 2 days in Harlan's courtroom had been about, and Abigail had been glad to keep it clean. She returned to Harrowfield in the early afternoon of the second day. The house was quiet in the particular way of a house in summer heat. The servants moving slowly, the children at their lessons with the tutor. Abigail had hired the previous spring, the whole structure of the day, suspended in the long amber stillness of a Virginia August. She went to her study. She sat at her desk. She pulled out the Philadelphia Trading House correspondence, 3 letters exchanged over the past 2 weeks. Each one moving the practical business of her account a step further toward active management, and she read through the most recent response from the account director. A careful and pleasingly direct man named Farrow, who had been managing her father's investments since 1803, and who had in their correspondence treated her as someone who understood what she was doing without requiring the slow introductory explanations that men in financial institutions often felt compelled to offer women as a courtesy that was not a courtesy. She wrote her response. She confirmed the investment instructions she had outlined in her second letter. She authorized the transfer of a portion of the account's liquid holdings to a Virginia account in her name at the Richmond Merchant Bank, where Aldridge had already arranged the paperwork. She sealed the letter. She set it on the left side of the desk. Then she opened the drawer and took out the letter she had written to Alden Moore in Fredericksburg, the most recent one in which she had confirmed her intention to occupy the Whitaker property beginning in September, and had requested that he arrange the end of the current tenant lease with appropriate notice and compensation. Moore had responded 2 days ago. The tenants had accepted the arrangement. The house would be ready. September was 6 weeks away. She put Moore's letter back in the drawer, and she sat for a moment in the quiet of her study in the house she had lived in for 8 years, and she let herself feel the full weight of what was ending. Not the marriage that had ended by degrees over years, and the ending of it had been so gradual that the final ceremony of the ring in his palm had been less a rupture than an acknowledgement of something that had already been true for a long time. What she was feeling now was something harder to name. The ending of a version of herself, the woman who had stayed, the woman who had managed and endured and worked in the small hours and asked for nothing and been given less. That woman had served her purpose. She had done extraordinary things. But she was finished now, and what came next would require someone different, not unrecognizable but newer, less armored, more her own. Abigail had always been good at transitions. She had simply never before been in a position to choose one entirely on her own terms. She told the children on a Saturday morning 3 days after the trial. She had thought carefully about how to do this. Not what to say exactly, but how to hold the conversation. She was not a woman who believed in softening true things to the point where they became untrue. But she understood that the way a true thing is given determines a great deal about how it is received, and these were her children, and what she said to them in the next hour would become part of how they understood their own story. She sat them at the kitchen table. Not the formal dining room, not her study. The kitchen where Dora's bread was cooling on the rack, and the morning light came through the east window, and everything smelled like something real and warm and safe. Eleanor sat across from her with her hands folded, which she did when she was preparing to receive important information. James sat beside his sister and ate a piece of bread with the concentrated attention of a 6-year-old, for whom the physical world remains the most pressing reality at any given moment. "I'm going to tell you something," Abigail said, "and I want you to ask me anything you want to ask me because I'm not going to keep things from you that affect your lives." Eleanor said, "Are you and Papa separating?" Abigail looked at her daughter, 6 years old, serious-eyed, watching her with that direct, searching attention that had always gone straight past surface. "Yes," she said, "we are." James looked up from his bread. "We are going to move to Grandfather Whitaker's house in Fredericksburg," Abigail said. "The one I told you about, with the big yard and the apple trees. We'll go in September." "Will Papa come?" James asked. "No," Abigail said. "Papa will stay at Harrowfield, but you will see him. He loves you both very much, and that isn't changing." James considered this with the practical directness of a child. "Does he know we're leaving?" "Not yet," Abigail said. "I'm going to tell him today." Eleanor had not looked away from her mother's face. "Are you sad, Mama?" Abigail met her daughter's eyes and gave her the thing she had always given her, the unvarnished truth. "Some," she said. "Not the way you might think. I'm sad about things that happened a long time ago. I'm not sad about what comes next." She reached across the table and covered Eleanor's folded hands with her own. "What comes next is going to be good, I promise you that." Eleanor turned her hand over and held her mother's. "I believe you," she said. James ate more bread. "Will there be horses in Fredericksburg?" he asked. "There will," Abigail said. "And you are going to learn to ride one properly, not just sit on one and fall off." "I didn't fall off," James said with considerable dignity. "You fell off twice," Eleanor said. "I dismounted dramatically," James said. Abigail laughed. It came out fully without the careful modulation she usually applied to her own expressions, and it felt like something opening. Eleanor looked startled for a moment, then smiled, and the smile was so entirely her father's that it made Abigail's heart do something complicated and then settle. She looked at her children across the kitchen table, the bread and the morning light, and the sound of Dora moving somewhere at the back of the house, and she thought this. This is what the past 6 months were for. Not the verdict, not the account, not even the ring on the table. This, the ability to sit in a kitchen with her children and tell them the truth and watch them hold it without breaking. She had earned this morning. She had worked for it in the dark for a long time.
Chatia.
She told Nathaniel that afternoon. She went to the estate office, where he spent most of his days now working through the reconstruction with Vance, learning the accounts he should have learned a decade ago, doing the patient, unglamorous work of understanding the thing he had owned without comprehending. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She came in, and she sat in the chair across from his desk, Pembroke's old chair. She noted, though it no longer felt like Pembroke's anything, and she looked at her husband. He looked, she thought, older than he had before the ball. Not in a bad way. Older the way a man looks when he has stopped performing youth, when the effort of the performance falls away, and what remains is more honest, if less polished. There were lines around his eyes she did not remember noticing. His hands resting on the desk were the hands of a man who had been working with them. "I've decided," she said without preamble, because she had no patience left for the preliminary architecture of difficult conversations. "The children and I will move to Fredericksburg in September. The Whitaker house. I've confirmed it with Moore." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He did not look surprised. He had the expression of a man who has been expecting something and is now experiencing the difference between expecting a thing and having it arrive. "All right," he said. The children will visit you. I want that to be structured and honored on both sides. I will not use them against you, and I expect the same." "You have it," he said. "The repayment from my account stands. Trent will handle the formal separation of the marital estate once the criminal proceedings are fully closed. I have retained Moore for the Fredericksburg side." "I've retained Vance for mine," he said. "I told him to give you whatever you ask for." She looked at him. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't make this a performance of generosity. Work with your lawyer and let me work with mine, and let's arrive at something fair. I don't want your generosity. I want an honest accounting." Something in him shifted. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry. I know." She folded her hands in her lap. "Nathaniel, I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it as what it is not, as an opening for negotiation and not as an invitation to respond." He waited. "I do not hate you," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because I think you may be constructing a version of this story in which you are the villain, and I am the wronged heroine, and that is simpler than what is true." She paused. "You were careless with me. You were vain, and you were self-deceiving, and you were for several years cruel, in the quiet way that is hardest to name and easiest to deny. But you were not a monster. You were a man who stopped paying attention to what mattered and paid the price for it." She looked at him steadily. "I do not hate you, but I cannot rebuild a life on the foundation of this marriage, and I am not willing to try." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was careful and low. "Is there anything I could—" He stopped, started differently. "If I had come to you, before all of this, if I had stopped and actually looked at you and asked you what was wrong—" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe. I don't deal in maybes anymore." He nodded. He looked at his hands. "The tenants," he said. "The ones I went to see. Old Henderson on the eastern parcel, he told me his wife had been worried about the missing payments, that she'd cried about it, that they'd almost pulled their youngest son from school because they thought the money was gone." He stopped. "I didn't know any of that. I didn't know any of their names 2 weeks ago." He looked up. "You knew, didn't you?" "I knew all 14 families," she said. "I've known them for years." He pressed his mouth together. He breathed out slowly. "Of course you did," he said quietly to himself, as much as to her. She stood. She had said what she came to say, and there was nothing left that conversation could productively hold, and she had learned in the past months the value of leaving a room at the right moment. "I'll be at Harrowfield through August," she said. "I'd like the remaining time to be civil." "It will be," he said. She walked to the door. Her hand was on the frame when he said her name. She stopped. She did not turn around. "I knew what you were when I married you," he said. "I want you to know that I remembered it, even in the worst of it, even when I was—" He stopped. "I never stopped knowing what you were. I just stopped being brave enough to deserve it." She stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about the girl with the ink-stained fingers at her father's table catching errors before they cost anything. She thought about the woman at the ledger desk in the small hours finding the first wrong number and following it with patient, lonely precision all the way to the truth. "I know," she said. And she walked out. Tuateg. August moved, the way August always moved in Virginia, slowly, heavily, with the thick insistence of a season that has overstayed but refuses to acknowledge it. Abigail worked through the month with the same organized efficiency she brought to everything. She packed carefully, and without sentiment, taking what was hers, and leaving what was Harrowfield's, which required knowing the difference which she did. She closed the accounts she needed to close, and opened the ones she needed to open. She wrote 14 letters to the tenant families, short and warm and direct, telling them that the estate records had been corrected and that she wished them well. She received 13 responses. One family had moved to Kentucky in the spring. Beatrice came twice more during August. Once to help with the children's packing, which she did with brisk, grandmotherly efficiency, while telling James stories about his grandfather Edmund Harrow and his lifelong horse ambitions. Once to sit with Abigail on the back porch in the evening heat and simply be there, which was Abigail had come to understand one of the most significant things one person could do for another. "You'll write to me," Beatrice said on that second evening. It was not a question. "Every week," Abigail said, "and you'll bring the children to Richmond for the harvest season." "Yes." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "I spent 20 years watching this family from the inside," she said. "Watching my husband, watching my son, watching the way this house operated and what it cost the women who lived in it." She paused. "I told myself it was the way of things, that the structure was the structure, and working within it was the only honest choice." She looked at Abigail. "You are the first person in this family who proved me wrong about that, and I am grateful to you for it, even at the cost of everything it cost." Abigail looked at her. "It didn't cost me as much as it saved me," she said. Beatrice reached over and patted her hand once firmly the way she did everything. "Good," she said. "Hold on to that." The 1st of September came on a Tuesday. The wagon was loaded before breakfast. Ruth supervised the loading with the authority of a woman who has strong opinions about how things should be secured for transport and is not interested in amateur input. James inspected every item that passed through the front door, with the serious attention of a boy conducting an official inventory. Eleanor helped carry the smaller boxes herself, steadily without fuss. Nathaniel came out of the house when the wagon was nearly full. He stood on the front steps, and he watched for a while, without speaking. Then he crouched down to James's level, and he held his son by both shoulders, and he said something low that Abigail could not hear, and James nodded, with a gravity that sat strangely and beautifully on his 6-year-old face. Then he stood, and he looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor walked to him without hesitation and hugged him with both arms, the way she hugged things she loved fully, without reservation, and he held her for a long moment with his eyes closed. When she pulled back, she looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "We'll come for harvest season," she said. Grandma Beatrice said. "I know," he said. "I'll be here." She nodded satisfied and went back to supervising James's inventory. Nathaniel straightened. He looked at Abigail across the yard. She was standing beside the wagon, her traveling coat on, despite the heat, the small cedar box under her arm. She had taken it from the high shelf the night before, not because she intended to live inside it, but because she intended to carry it with her, because those 3 things, the note and the letter and the ring, were part of her story, and she did not believe in leaving parts of your story behind. You carried them, and they became lighter, and eventually they became simply part of the weight you were built to carry, which was not the same as being burdened by them. He crossed the yard to her. He stopped 3 feet away, the distance of a man who has learned too late, but genuinely the value of not taking up more space than he has been given. "Are you ready?" he asked. It was not the right question. She had been ready for months, but she understood that he was not asking about the wagon. "Yes," she said. He looked at the cedar box. "Take care of yourself, Abigail." "I always have," she said. That was never the problem. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded once, and he stepped back, and she turned and helped Eleanor up onto the wagon seat, and handed James up after her, and climbed up herself, and Ruth settled beside the driver, and the wagon moved. Abigail did not look back. Not because she was angry, and not because she was performing resolve, and not because she was afraid that looking back would weaken her. She did not look back because she was already thinking forward about 40 acres and apple trees, and 14 tenant families she had yet to meet about the Philadelphia account, and the letters from Pharaoh, and the particular pleasure of managing something that was entirely unambiguously hers. About Eleanor learning the columns, and James on a horse he had not yet fallen off. About mornings at her own desk, in her own house, where the only ledger that required her attention was the one she had chosen. She was thinking about all of it, the whole wide-open shape of what came next, when the house disappeared behind the tree line, and Virginia spread out ahead of her in the full gold heat of an early September morning, and she breathed it in and let it be exactly what it was. The months that followed were the busiest of her life, which was saying something. The Whitaker house required work. Not emergency work, but the patient, purposeful kind that comes from a house that has been well maintained by good tenants, but has not been lived in by its owner. She learned every inch of it. She talked to every person on the property. She hired 3 additional workers from the county labor pool, 2 women among them, which drew comment from the neighboring farms and which she ignored entirely. By October, she had restructured the farm's account system using principles she had developed during the Harrowfield work: simpler, more transparent, harder to manipulate, accidentally or deliberately. By November, the harvest accounts balanced to the penny on the first try. She allowed herself a small private satisfaction about this that she shared with no one except Ruth, who said naturally, with the conviction of a woman who had never doubted the outcome. She began receiving visitors. Not social calls. She had no patience for social calls in the early months when there was too much real work requiring her attention. These were practical visitors. A widow in the next county who had a tenant dispute that her late husband's solicitor had been unable to resolve. A young woman from town whose family's farm accounts were in disorder following her father's illness. Abigail sat with both of them, went through the relevant documents, and explained in plain language what the numbers showed and what the legal options were. She did not charge for this. She had not intended it to become a practice. But the widow told a friend, and the friend told a cousin. And by December, Abigail had seen 6 women with account or property questions at her kitchen table, and she had helped all of them, and 3 of them had brought her something in return: a jar of preserves, 2 loaves of bread, a bolt of good cotton. Not as payment, which would have made it a transaction, but as acknowledgement, which made it something else entirely. She wrote to Beatrice about it in November. Beatrice wrote back within a week, "I am not surprised. I am glad. Keep going." She kept going. The twist that came in December was the one she had not planned for, which was perhaps why it arrived with such force. His name was Thomas Albright. He was 40 years old, a widower, a land surveyor from Fredericksburg's neighboring county, who had been hired by Moore to conduct the formal survey of the Whitaker property boundaries, a routine process that Moore had recommended to ensure the estate documentation was complete before the legal separation from the marital estate was fully finalized. He came on a Wednesday morning. He was a tall, quietly spoken man with surveyor's hands, scarred and precise, the hands of someone who spends his days measuring things exactly. And he had a habit of looking at the land around him with the attentive stillness of a man who finds the world genuinely interesting and is not performing that interest. He finished the survey in 2 days. On the second afternoon, he knocked at the kitchen door to present his report to Moore's representative, who was waiting in the front parlor, and Abigail happened to be at the kitchen table going over the December accounts when he knocked, and Ruth brought him in without thinking, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw her at the table with the ledgers open and said, "I beg your pardon, ma'am. I was looking for the gentleman from Moore's office." "He's in the parlor," Abigail said. "Through the hall, second door." He said thank you. He went through the hall. He came back 20 minutes later after the Moore representative had confirmed the report and left, because he had left his coat on the hook by the kitchen door and had to retrieve it. He found Abigail still at the table. She had not moved. She was working through the December figures with her pen in her right hand and her left hand holding the page flat, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Your coat's on the hook." And he said, "Yes, thank you, ma'am." And he took the coat, and then he stopped. "Forgive me," he said. "Are those farming accounts?" "They are," she said. "I can see from here that your Eastern Boundary Survey figure matches the county record," he said. "That's not always the case. Most people don't know to check." She looked up at him properly. "I always check," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with the attentive stillness she had noticed before. Then he said, "I reckon you do," and he said good afternoon and he left. She went back to the December figures. She worked for another hour. When she finished, she set down the pen, and she sat back in her chair, and she looked at the kitchen at the late December light, and the warm smell of Dora's cooking, and the sound of the children upstairs, and she thought without quite meaning to, about a man with surveyor's hands who said, "I reckon you do," with the ease of someone who means it as a compliment and not a surprise. She did not do anything about this thought. She was not ready, and she knew she was not ready, and she had always had the self-knowledge to understand the difference between a thing that is interesting and a thing that is time. But she held it for a moment before she set it aside. That was new. 6 months ago, she would not have held it at all. It was Moore who told her in January that Albright had asked after her. Casually, Moore said in the context of a professional conversation about the property survey, Albright had inquired whether Mrs. Harrow was managing the Whitaker farm herself, and Moore had said yes, and Albright had said, "She's running good accounts. The numbers I saw on that table were organized better than most farms twice the size." Moore told her this with the deliberate neutrality of a man who has practiced law for 40 years and understands that the accurate delivery of information is his job, and the management of the emotional implications is not. Abigail said, "Thank you, Moore," with the same neutrality, and moved on to the next item of business, which was the final document in the Harrowfield legal separation, the last paper to be signed, the one that would close the accounting between her life before September and her life after it. She signed it. She watched Moore seal it. She walked out of his office into the cold January morning, and she stood on the street in Fredericksburg with her coat pulled close, and she breathed in the winter air, and she thought done. Not the word she had used at the courthouse that had been the legal done, the verdict, done the Pembroke and Geary done. This was a different kind. Quieter. More complete. The done of a woman who has finished something long and difficult and hard, and is now standing on the other side of it whole and clear-eyed and entirely her own. She walked back to her horse. She rode home through the January cold, through fields that were hers outright, unencumbered, documented to the penny, and she thought about the farm accounts and the women at her kitchen table and the survey report and the Philadelphia account and Eleanor learning columns and James learning to stay on his horse. And she thought about spring, which was coming, which always came, which had always been the thing about Virginia that she had loved even when she had not been able to love much else about her life in it. Spring was coming. She had work to do. She was exactly who she had always been, and she had never not once needed anyone's permission to be that. She rode home in the cold and the pale winter light, and she was not waiting for anything, and she was not afraid of anything, and she was not looking back. A woman who knows her own worth does not shrink to fit the space a small man made for her. She builds a larger room, and she fills every inch of it on her own terms.